What's up my dudes, and welcome back to PLB Green. Today I'm going to be making a floating island terrarium. Before the project begins, I'm heading outside to my bonsai shelves and peeling back some moss that I'm going to use in this project. Just because I took a little bit doesn't mean it won't grow back. Everything I need for this project is right here on the table. You don't have to go this complicated, you keep it much more simple if you like, but I've got a jigsaw, some clamps. This is the jar that I'm going to be hanging the floating island in, and at the moment it doesn't have a lid, and I want to keep the condensation of the water inside here, so I am actually going to cut out a wooden circular lid. To do this, I just take a length of plywood and I trace around the diameter of the vase. I then take my jigsaw and have a go at trying to cut the circle out as best as I can, but the jigsaw can't really make too tight of turns, so I have to do this in stages. After a few cuts, I managed to cut out the general circle. I kind of like the look of the rough sides, but not too rough. Grab some sandpaper and I sand down the edges, but I don't sand them into a perfect circular form, as I kind of like the rough edges. I have to make a small hole in the center of the circle, just so I can put a little eye hook pin from where the island can hang. The next part is the fun part, and this is where we get to scape the little island piece of driftwood that I have. This piece of driftwood was collected from the wild. It is a mangrove piece of driftwood. I've boiled it in a pot in water just to make sure I got rid of all the bacteria or any mold that might have been on there. And this is where I get to use sphagnum moss, the mosses and baby tears I collected from my garden earlier, and I have a little stash of Anubias petite, which I can pick some off, and even though this is usually an aquarium plant, you can actually use it in terrarium setups like this one. So you can see here my lid is all done. I'm going to give it a coat of clear lacquer. The eye hook is attached directly in the center, and the piece of mangrove will essentially hang from a piece of fishing line in the center of the tube, and then this will go on top, so it'll be attached to the eye hook. Now, I don't want this to be airtight, and it's not airtight. Air can get in a little bit in the gap between the lid and the container. That's what I want. I'll just keep topping up the water that is sitting at the bottom of the container as it evaporates out of the jar. So let's get to scaping. At first I thought I was going to be filling this gap here, this crevice, with sphagnum moss and planting it out. But after close inspection of the piece of driftwood, I kind of like that gap as a feature, the cabin as a feature. I think the shadow it holds and just the dimension it gives to the piece of wood is really cool. So I'm thinking of actually leaving this gap empty and planting around the other parts of the driftwood. That means I probably don't need to use sphagnum moss, because I was going to fill the gap with sphagnum moss for planting, but instead I have decided to just go with the terrestrial moss, and if you look on the back, there's still some sediment on there, and if I just use fishing line and attach the moss in various places on the log, that'll be enough to keep it alive, especially because this log will stay quite moist as it's hanging in the terrarium because of the water at the bottom that's constantly evaporating. So I am going to get into some scaping with a fishing line, terrestrial mosses such as these. Got this one, which is, it's put all its little spores out, which is really cool. It has a really cool effect. It makes it look really miniature. And I have some various other species here. And then of course I have the baby tears, which is a classic in a lot of my setups. And I'll try and incorporate that somewhere, as well as the Anubias petite. I'm just using regular fishing line here, and I'm going to tie a knot in it around the driftwood and wrap it around the moss and other plants to secure them on for a couple of months, or at least until the moss and plants attach themselves to the log naturally. Moss is such a versatile plant. You can rip it apart any way you like into any shape and squish it into areas and fit it as you please. Here I have some baby tears, and this isn't a moss, but it does grow prolifically in terrarium environments. You got to keep an eye on it though, it will get out of hand. Just a quick trim every now and then with a pair of scissors. But it does grow very, very well. You can even get it to look kind of vine-like. In the end, I've decided to add a little bit of moss into the crevice at the front of the driftwood. I think it looks nice and it gives it dimension. Anytime I find a small bump or crevice where moss will stick to naturally, I just add it. And in the end, it'll grow where it can grow, where it gets moisture, and it just looks really natural. With Anubias petite, all you have to do is pull small chunks off and split the parts off the plant. As long as you're not damaging the roots too much and you're keeping a little bit of root on each of your small pieces of plant, they will actually survive. You'd probably need to spray them down every couple of days with dechlorinated water just to keep them nice and fresh. They are an aquarium plant, but they can adapt to a terrarium environment. Anubias petite is one of the smallest Anubias species, so it can make scapes and projects like this have a lot of scale to them and make them look quite large when they're not. I use the same technique with the fishing wire and the moss on the Anubias, and it will adapt to a terrarium lifestyle just fine. Here I'm just attaching the driftwood floating island to the top of the lid, adding some dechlorinated water and placing the final product. Thanks so much for watching, guys. See you next time on PLB Green.